Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first panel session of our conference on race and privilege in international development work at home and abroad. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. There is tech support available, so if you have any tech issues, you can go to the chat function, select all panelists, and just write, "I'm having a tech issue," explain what it is, and you'll get a response from ACGC tech support. Please also use the chat box just to participate and leave comments. If you have a question, please put it in the question and answer box, and we'll come around to the question and answer period at the end. This session will also be recorded, so it started being recorded now, but it will stop being recorded before the Q&A, so no attendees will be recorded. Feel free to also join our conversation on social media by hashtagging ACGCRelearn and tagging ACGCNow on any platform. Please remember to also remain respectful in your comments and questions. At ACGC, we have a zero tolerance policy for hate speech and harassment, and we would like this conference to be a safe space. Now, I am honored to welcome Dr. Philomena Okeke Ihejirika. She'll be moderating today's session. Dr. Okeke is a professor at the University of Alberta's Women and Gender Studies Department. She's also the director of the Pan-African Collaboration for Excellence and has carried out over 30 projects on gender issues in African and African immigrant populations. Her publication track record reflects an extensive knowledge of transnational, post-colonial, and intersectional feminist approaches. Her research in Canada is supported by prominent funders like SSHRC and Status of Women Canada. Her work in Africa is supported by Carnegie Corporation, Rotary International, and the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa, among others. She's a Killam Scholar, a Carnegie Fellow, and a collaborating researcher within the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. She's also an adjunct professor in a number of African universities and a member for the College of Mentors to Africa's universities. Dr. Okeke, welcome to the conference. I'll invite you to unmute and begin the session.
Thank you very much, Lasha, and welcome to all our participants, and I mean those who are here to listen to these very brilliant speakers today. We have a fairly tight program, so we'll get started. Tight in the sense that we actually do have we actually do have a number of highly placed people, but we have 5. So we're going to have to race through, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. I will begin with our first speaker, Dr. Wilton Littlechild. Dr. Littlechild is a former Grand Chief of Treaty 6 and she's the honorary chief of the Mascaris Crees. He is a Cree. He's also a lawyer and a global advocate for Indigenous rights. Dr. Littlechild has served as an MP from 1988 to 1983 and served on committees in the House of Commons and United Nations. Of course, this goes far. His CV is very long, so I would just encourage you to please take time to look at the accomplishments. He's here to talk to us about perspective on development from his own social background in connection to development work in Canada and beyond. I will also be very brief about the CVs of other speakers, since I'm quite aware that we have a very short time. Our next speaker will be Dr. Nathan Andrews. Dr. Andrews is a professor of global and international studies in the University of Northern British Columbia. He is obviously, he is a former ACGC top 30 under 30. Dr. Andrews is currently an assistant professor, and his research interests include international political economy of resource extraction, international development and global governance. He is published widely in these areas and has also volunteers with international organizations, including the Red Cross. Our third speaker will be Ms. Imam Bukhtari. She is the founder and CEO of the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation. Imam holds a master's degree in multimedia communication and is the CEO of the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation. She actually has worked and volunteered in the not-for-profit sector, believe you me, for over 10 years, as young as she is, and has received, again, the ACGC's Top 30 Under 30 Award, is the producer of documentaries, sits on the government of Alberta's Anti-Racism Advisory Council, among other positions. Our fourth speaker is Mai Ngo. I hope I got this pronunciation right. She is the author of Canadian Youth Volunteering Abroad, Rethinking Issues of Power and Privilege. Mai is a gender equity, diversity and inclusion specialist with over 15 years of experience. I can see from her CV, she has really done a lot of work on gender issues, both in terms of evaluation and implementation of projects. She has worked with a lot of agencies as a consultant. In fact, she worked anywhere from City Hall to Ottawa. Her expertise has been in very much demand. Again, I will leave you to really take time and go and check out the CVs of these speakers. Our last but not the least speaker is Ms. Larissa Crawford, who is the founder and managing director of Future Ancestor Services. She is a published Indigenous and anti-racism researcher, award-winning ribbon skirt artist, restorative circle keeper, and proudly passes on, obviously, she is of Métis and Jamaican ancestry. She is the founder of Future Ancestor Services, a youth-led professional service social enterprise that advances quick and climate justice through lenses of ancestral accountability and anti-racism. Just want to say that she is really involved in a lot of advocacy work, among others, and also shares her expertise as an advisor on various panels, as well as various ministries. I will leave you again to check out their CV. We don't have a whole lot of time, so I beg your indulgence for us to quickly get started. The way that we're going to carry on this discussion, because of the shortness of our time, is to really ask each one of you to respond to a question. You respond to the question, and by the time the 5 of you have finished the first response, we are going to have a second, which is a general question for every one of you, after which we'll open it up for Q&A. I think we're doing well with introductions at 6 minutes. Okay. Again, welcome to the panel. And for our, those who are watching, who are coming in through the chats, welcome again. I will begin with Dr. Larissa Crawford's question. And it's up to you to respond to this question anyhow you want to. Dr. Littlechild, as a world-renowned leader in Indigenous rights, the former Grand Chief of Treaty 6, and having worked with multiple committees from the House of Commons to the United Nations, we really pose this question to you. How have you seen racism and Western privilege negatively affect Indigenous communities globally as they work towards realizing their own human rights and sustainable development? A very tall order, but whatever you can do for this question in a short time, we will appreciate it. You have the floor. You're muted. Could somebody unmute here? Good.
Thank you very much. First, I bring you greetings in my language. And I want to make a comment about your endeavor here, because I feel that it's extremely important and timely to unlearn and relearn international development beyond 2020. In fact, it reminds me of a journey I took with the Red Cross youth at one time in a similar endeavor. So I commend all of you who organized this conference or dialogue. I was asked as a member of the Red Cross youth with a question, along with others, what do you think Canada will look like 20 years from now? Then we were called back 20 years after, and it was a bit scary in a way, but very important to realize the importance of this kind of a format. We were about 85% correct in our youth estimation of what Canada was going to look like 20 years after. So I think this is a similar journey. Local engagement in the international development initiatives since 1977 myself, through the International Organization of Indigenous Resource Development. Our aim was very similar to yours in that it was to build an inclusive, peaceful, and healthy world. For us, it was a natural because we have Treaty Number 6, an international agreement, and the agreement is about peace and friendship. So I used this to backdrop my comments to answer your question. We, through the COVID pandemic, utilized our treaty articles, the Medicine Chest Clause and the Famine and Pestilence Clause, to help us get through this calamity. And it's interesting because those words were negotiated on our behalf by our ancestors back in 1876 and 1877. So to take stock of the state of the sector is extremely important, not only for discussions, but what will the new norm be post-COVID? It's interesting to look at it also from an elder's teaching. One of our elders said to us one time, you must look backwards to see where you came from. If you are to know where you are today, in order for you to know where you're going to be going tomorrow. So I really enjoy this framework for this discussion. And to get to your real question, of course, the answer is yes. I have seen negative impact of racism in the Indigenous communities globally. But I want to focus on one element, one aspect of your topic. And it's about, let's talk about it, race. During the time I served as a commissioner on the Saskatchewan Justice Commission to reform the justice system, I was one of the first commissioners to look at racism, for example, in policing, but racism generally. And then the World Conference Against Racism came along. I was one of the keynote speakers back then. Mind you, now we're on our 4th decade of look at racism and a decade against racism. So it's not an easy answer when we come to talk about racism. But what I did learn in those two experiences, first as a commissioner and then being involved in the World Conference Against Racism, was this is actually the first step. the first step to racism is to be able to talk about it. So I commend you for organizing it in that way. To talk about it, it's crucially important. For example, I dealt with the night tours. The night tours were a situation in Saskatchewan where young Indigenous men were taken out in the city limits in the middle of winter, told to take their shoes off, and some of them froze to death because they were told to walk back to the city without their shoes on. But fortunately, Great Spirit works in mysterious ways. A couple of them survived and lived to tell what happened to them. So these were called the night tours, where they were taken outside of the city limits and had to walk back without any shoes on. So that's one story. Another one is to, again, to look at Saskatchewan, the recent incident regarding the Bushi case, shooting that occurred in the country in Saskatchewan. But one of the ones that touches me most is at the UN, a chief came to me from a different country and asked me to speak for him because he said, I can't speak right now because I'm so devastated, because I got a phone call last night that our oldest living woman, medicine woman in my community was raided in her little village home last night by 4 men who called her outside and asked her, are you the medicine woman of this community? And she said, yes. So they said, well, get down on your knees and start singing a medicine song. So as she was singing a medicine song, those 4 men shot her while she was on her knees. And this was just 2 years ago. I also took the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls story to the UN back in 1998, the first time it was heard around the world. And at the time, and I know one is too many, but there were only 300 Indigenous women that had been murdered and were missing. And of course, now we know it's almost 3,000. So it hasn't gotten better. Another one is what I call a spiritual theft, where an elder couple were singing a welcome song, and their song without permission was taken from them and broadcast. Actually became a theme song for the Atlanta Olympics, and they were not even asked for permission for that song to be used, especially at such a high event like the Olympics. And recently, of course, we've heard a lot about the Black Lives Matter, and my own brother was shot by police. So I discussed these at the UN because there's many, many, many stories like this around the world where Indigenous peoples have been attacked by racism. So our Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, when we went across the country to listen to stories about what happens to children when you remove them from their parents and what happens to the parents when you do that to them, we focused a solution for reconciliation by calling for action against racism. For example, the justice area, the police, lawyers, judges have really recently gotten together to try and change the past
I had to come in here, Doctor. If you can kind of shorten it so that we can hear from the other four. So if you can just kind of summarize.
I was just about to close with one other example. Academia, the faculties of medicine, education, law are now having to teach about the Indigenous peoples of Canada, the relationship, but also anti-racism. It's mandatory now that it be taught in schools. And yesterday's newspaper, if you looked at it, you'll have a real good example of a positive follow-up by the chief of police in the city of Edmonton, who vowed to address racism in the city of Edmonton. And just before that, the RCMP also called for working together towards reconciliation. So these are just some examples of the negative side in terms of what happened to Indigenous peoples, but what's also happening now in terms of changing to a better situation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Littlechild. He has really gone through a good number of examples. These are food for thought for every one of us. And with that, I'll go to the next speaker. Dr. Andrews, our question to you is, what does the presence of foreign aid workers, researchers, volunteers represent to people within project countries overseas? Can we understand this better by applying a post-colonial or anti-colonial lens to international development? And again, I would say if you can just keep the discussion a little bit in a summary, because we'll come back with the Q&A. Please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you for this. I will summarize and I'll hopefully keep it under 4 minutes or 3 minutes if I can. Sorry here, this is my... So the question is very big, and I think I might not be able to answer it within the short time frame, but I think I would say, and it somewhat alludes to a lot of what the speaker said an hour or so ago. Angela, she spoke fantastically about all of these questions that we'll probably addressing in this panel here. But one thing I would say, or a couple of things I would say, is that the fact that if you see a lot of these foreign workers, you see a lot of these researchers coming in from overseas to different parts of the world, the assumption is that these people that are, on the ground, these individuals and communities and local people cannot think for themselves. They are not well equipped to address their own problems from their own perspectives, right? And that sort of underlines the reason why you will find a lot of people flying in and out of these countries, because assume that they have the knowledge, they have the capacity, they have the power, and of course they have the money, and they can decide to spend it the way they want. And so they're able to move to these countries because they qualify to understand the context of these people a bit more than the people themselves, which is the problem, which really underpins the racist stereotypes that is informed by, of course, colonialism, imperialism, and all of that, right? So if you think about this from a post-colonial lens, you would think that one major thing you would imagine is to sort of move beyond these colonial assumptions that people from below, people from the global south are not knowledgeable, they are not equipped, they are not empowered enough, they don't know much, so we have to go and teach them. We have to go in with our skills and knowledge, we have to go in with all our tools to be able to teach them the way they should develop. And again, the notion of development itself is no longer, people are being politically correct these days. And so no, we don't talk about individuals in the global south as being backward or being primitive or being tradition bound and all of those, derogatory remarks that were used to describe people in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, right? Now we're not using that anymore. But if you think of how we're doing development and sort of the understanding of development and how people are put it into practice, you would see that these colonial assumptions and pretensions are still part of development practice as we see it today. And so that is a major challenge. And so if you're understanding it from the anti-colonial, post-colonial perspective, one thing you would imagine is sort of the possibility of moving around this power relationship, the fact that someone has more power than another person and is able to tell them and is able to show them what to do about their own situations that they should know better about. You would think that a post-colonial orientation would help us to move beyond that and reimagine a way in which we can actually understand that people also know something, that everyone knows something. Local knowledge is knowledge, right? And it's not just going to be relegated, and we're not going to just expect that, consultants who, are considered very knowledgeable and experts in certain fields are able to provide solutions to the problems that we face. So I think this is just going to be my brief approach, sort of answer to these two questions. And I hope that I think I'll have a chance to sort of shed a bit more light on it in the Q&A.
You from what I hear, I see also undercurrents with what Dr. Literature is saying. How far have we really moved from that perspective of, from that colonial perspective of you come to a population move to a place and decide there's no one there. Yeah. There are people there, but there's no one there, and they set up shop. Mm-hmm. People think because colonization has ended in other parts of the developing world beyond settler colonization, such as in Canada. But it is still alive and well in terms of the existing relationships and the perception in terms of how the formerly colonized still relate with those who are colonized. Thank you. Again, I agree with you. It's a very big question, but you have given it enough for the chat boxes to start roaring. Thank you very much. I will now move on to my Ngo. I want to, our own question, the question here again is a tall order, but you just in response so we can whet people's appetite on the Q&A. Volunteer abroad programs are widely popular among Canadian students and youth. Additionally, volunteerism is the backbone of many international development organizations. Their programming and a lot of the initiatives they have abroad. How do issues of race and privilege play out when students and aid workers volunteer abroad? What should organizations and individuals need to be mindful of before making the decision to volunteer abroad?
Thanks, Dr. Phil. I think this is such a, in terms of international volunteering, it's one of the main areas where race and privilege play out. The keynote speaker said that nowhere is power imbalance more clear. And I think when you look at the history of international volunteering in Canada, it does come from an international development historical background, which inherently gives it a lot of issues around race and power and privilege because it's embedded in a very colonial structure. I can see this in various levels. So you see this still in levels at the country level when things play out. You see it within the community levels. You see it within individual levels. And I think the thing with international volunteering is a lot of the times the question is, what can we do as individuals? And there's a lot we can do as individuals, but the other question that I like to ask as well, and being a full-time consultant with global affairs, we can see it so much embedded in the power structures. I'll give you an example of how I've experienced race and power in international volunteering. And this was when I was 19 years old. So it was the first time that I was going to volunteer abroad. This was, prior to me having gray hair, and I'm still being quite young and naive. But I decided to go to Vietnam, which is where my blood originates from and where my parents were born. And I really had such a fascinating time volunteering there because I was both an insider and an outsider. And at 19 years old, having experienced, so my first, I volunteered in a few places. One was in an orphanage and one was with street workers. And so, some typical volunteering experiences, that a lot of youth would get in terms of volunteering abroad. And I remember it was really, really interesting for me because when I was working in the orphanage, for example, the Vietnamese workers would not see me as Canadian. And those that were expats that came in, you know, coming from Canada, the US, Australia, the UK, they wouldn't see me as Western, unless I spoke, and then you could kind of hear the that I didn't have, you know, a Vietnamese accent. And so that allowed me to really view how race and power really play out in a way that really disturbed me at the time when I was 19, because I could see how Vietnamese workers would switch their way of being when you had foreigners around, specifically, you know, white foreigners. And then you could really see the power dynamics playing out, the way that they would quiet down, the way that they softened their language. And so that allowed foreigners to also see Vietnamese people as, you know, soft, submissive, Asian. So kind of playing out those stereotypes. And so I think as a volunteer, if we're going abroad and we're not aware of the power dynamics that we bring and that it's rooted in colonialism, the very structure of volunteering, then we are at risk of, you know, repeating these the power dynamics at play. So I hope that answers a bit of your question.
I find it so interesting because these are some of the complex dynamics we don't think much about. We always think it's they and us. But if you look at what plays out in development work, there are other levels of undercurrents that we don't look at. And even if you begin, first of all, by people who want to go, when someone says, oh, you know, when I finish my degree, I want to go to Africa, I would like to teach in a high school. I'd like to go and teach French in Mali, West Africa. Or I really want to begin my career by working in an orphanage in Nigeria. A lot of them don't think of the racism in what they are saying. The fact that there are tons of young Nigerian people who will take half of your salary or even 1/4 of what you're paid and do a better job than you. Secondly, for those, we still need our young people to go and get some kind of experience outside of the West. You're there, but they don't see you as a white person because they have their own stereotypical view of who lives in the West. I can tell you that most people, when they come here, until they arrive in Canada, they do not know that there are Indigenous people in Canada. They don't know that. Why is it that we don't have that information? That's what we have to ask. Why is it that we don't? And why is also, I keep asking that Africans who are Indigenous people themselves come to this country and go their separate ways from Indigenous people? Why is it that they don't come together? Because that's a very, very powerful gunpowder. But no, they are made to go in separate ways. These are channels of thought that I will just leave us to keep thinking about. But I will want to keep us, because I want us to listen to our last and not the least speaker, so we can open up for Q&A. This question is for Larissa. Larissa, we want to ask our last question. As Canada's international development organizations, researchers and volunteers move towards racial equality in their work abroad, how can they address and be mindful of the issues of racism and privilege here at home? And how can they make the important links that ensure that nobody is left behind in the march towards sustainable development?
Thank you so much. Tansé, qui a m'aidé, Larissa Crawford de Schnick, bonjour. Je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. So in response to the question, so this is a two-parter. So I'm gonna be as quick as possible and as actionable as possible. So how can people working towards racial equity abroad really address and be mindful of issues of racism and privilege here at home? So to begin with a bit of storytelling, and again, I'll keep it quick, but I spent a lot of my youth, a lot of my teens doing international development work. So I started a library in Ghana, which prompted my interest in studying international development. I spent a year studying in Istanbul and working with refugees, and then traveled all throughout South America working. And it was actually after I got back from Istanbul that I started reflecting on, why do I still feel so lost? Like, I know I want to do development work, but I feel so lost in direction. And in critical self-reflection, I realized that, wow, it was not appropriate for me to be doing that work abroad. I was not in a position where I knew the language, where I knew where these people were coming from, and it was not a best use of my skills. And so in that critical self-reflection and understanding what do I want to do, I started looking at my values. I started looking at, why am I valuing work abroad so much more than I value the work that I could be doing at home for the communities I belong to? And it was through that critical self-reflection of first wanting to understand myself. And Dr. Littlechild, when the quote you shared at the beginning, the teaching you shared at the beginning about understanding where we've been to understand where we are to understand where we're going, is very much a process that I went through in reflecting on my own ancestry and positioning my own privilege here, and in understanding really, why do I want to do this work? And so I stopped focusing on what everyone else thought about my work and started thinking about, what do I really value and who can I serve to the best of my abilities in an appropriate and ethical way? And I think that more people need to start with asking that question before jumping to go abroad. I really value the experience I had, but in doing that, it came at the cost of not appropriately providing services that I was offering. And so I'd say starting with that. So I graduated from my undergrad 2 years ago. And now with Future Ancestor Services, we're working with a lot of federal ministries right now, actually in developing their anti-racism trainings. One of them being global affairs. And so we're working a lot with a lot of different kinds of branches in these kind of discussions. But with all of our clients right now, we're starting with conversations about white fragility. We're starting with conversations about privilege. And one thing that I try to communicate to all of my clients is that this practice of having difficult conversations, this practice of critical self-reflection is a skill. And if we understand it as a skill, then we understand that we can practice those skills. With difficult conversations about race and privilege in the workplace, there are different tools that you can use to prepare for those conversations, to practice those conversations. If someone at the dinner table or in the office said something super problematic, and you didn't have the energy or confidence to confront that in the moment, then practicing that in your rants and identifying in a debrief rant, like with a family or friend, wow, this person said something extremely problematic. This is why it was. Oh, wait, I don't have enough information to really back my opinion on this. So I'm going to go research that. So then when I'm in that position again, I feel more confident to confront that position or to confront that misconception and possibly that racist belief. And so practicing this, these skills, practicing this critical self-reflection is so important. And after I'm done speaking, I'll share in the chat, particularly a training excerpt that we have on whiteness and white fragility in terms of using a specific tool to confront that and reflect on that in your personal lives. So that's something that we're starting with, especially in the international development space, and having those conversations. And then another thing that I see a lot of our clients doing, that I see a lot of people in groups doing, is having and creating intentional space to talk about it. So oftentimes we're going into organizations and holding facilitated dialogues where as a third party, we're being brought in to share information, but then also facilitate a dialogue where people who may not want to share something to their manager can share it to us. We anonymize the information and then we can share it back. But the message, I guess, there is to hold space to talk about this in your lives, in your workplaces, asking questions about how does whiteness inform how we operate? How does this idea of Canadians knowing best inform how we operate? And having just done this with a very large nonprofit working in international development, holding the space to have this conversation, we found really interesting divisions, really interesting ways that Canadian privilege and Western privilege particularly with regards to whiteness, informed how the organization operated and how people were being treated even as employees, but in other nations. So with regards to compensation, benefits, accommodation, security and protection, mobility, all of these things came out of a conversation that hadn't been provided before. So holding these spaces.
Here, because we have one more speaker to go, okay?
I was just saying, so holding these spaces is a really important piece.
Imam, and I'm sorry about that. Imam Bukhtari, we have this question for you. And again, they are big, but do whatever justice you can to it. As discussions around racism have become more open in Canada, I hope, many organizations, including those in the international development sector, are looking for and developing tools and policies to increase racial diversity and inclusion. How significant, in your view, is diversity at staff and board level for an organization, especially for organizations that work with racialized communities? How diverse is diverse enough?
So that statement, diverse enough, kind of goes about the idea of an end goal, which is a problem in itself, because improvement, no matter what kind of improvement in life, is a continued ongoing process, just like anti-racism work is continued work. If we look at Google, for example, I recently read an article that I can't remember what website on, but it said something like Google spends $150 million on diversity programs. I think it was in 2015 it referenced alone, and yet by 2019, it was specific to the African American population, made up 2% of its tech workforce. So here's an organization that says, hey, we spend millions of dollars on diversity. So who are we gonna, how are we gonna say what the problem really is here? Is it Google, or the fact that perhaps not enough people are applying, or are they qualified? Google is at fault here for failing to address the shortage of African Americans that enter in computer science programs. How is it that like this huge company can tell me directions to go anywhere in this world or anything that I need in a matter of seconds, but they can't figure out how to attract and retain more Black engineers in America or elsewhere? What needs to happen essentially is that organizations need to see how their structures are essentially oppressive towards some people, and creating an equitable workplace will require more than just workshops, trainings, check marks that leave untouched power structures and systems of equity. Because diversity training at the end of the day isn't going to fix pay inequities or even police brutality, really. Racist structures weren't built in a day, and they're not going to disappear in a few hours training or even monthly training. And a few unconscious bias training seminars won't fix it. All of this is honestly like window dressing or little things that are nice to have, but to have longer process, you need to look at organizational policies. You need to look at how are you going to reorganize at the heart of structural inequities. Who are the people who actually make the decisions? City of Calgary, for example, is doing did an anti-racism hearing. They're having this anti-racism process, and what we got out of it from some counselors is that, oh look, 3 or 4 of our counselors are people of color. Okay, that's not enough. It's not about, is it diverse enough? It's like, at the end of the day, it's admin that makes the decisions. It's not even council. Council gives you money. Admin does the work. Look at your power structures within admin. Who are your leaders? All white, all white. That is the problem here. If we want to look at changing our systems, we got to look at who we're hiring and who are the ones that have the power.
Thank you so much, Imam. You remind me of what Sarah Ahmed said. She actually calls diversity work. She calls it happy talk. Universities hire people in diversity and they'll say, oh, we have the policy and we've hired someone in that area and that solves diversity. We find staff dealing, they call it EDI. They just hire a staff to do EDI and they've done their work. You have the policy statement, you have the staff to do it, but nothing happens. It's called happy talk. And I completely agree with you until we actually want to tackle the systemic structures. I don't know where we're going. I think at this point, I just want to, every time you have these panels, you keep learning more and more and more. There's so much to say, and I wish we can go forward even to do a little bit more talk. But I think just before we open it up to our chat group, I'd like you to very quickly, just no more than 10 seconds. We have just about 3 minutes. We want to save we want to save about 8 minutes for chat. So just quickly answer a very, very quick, just kind of a closing question. After we've talked about some of these things, and it would be good to think about what kind of concrete actions that organizations and individuals can take in international development in order to move forward to addressing anti-racism. Just very quick statements so that we can round it up at 2:50. We have 2 minutes, and then we can open it up for chat. I will start first of all with Dr. Littlechild, but if you don't want to say something, that's okay, but I will go in the same order that we went. First of all, Dr. Littlechild, Dr. Andrews, Mai, Imam, and Larissa.
Oops.
You're still muted. Lasha, can you unmute it? Because I think you, okay, good.
Yeah, there we go. I think we need to also talk about development work at home. Canada as a donor country, for us is a barrier many times. Because it is a donor, we try to work with other international bodies, and we're told because Canada is a donor, you don't qualify. But I want to reflect also on the Millennium Development Goals. When they were proclaimed at the UN, Indigenous peoples were really left behind. So we designed our own Millennium Development Goals. Now that we're at the stage of the Sustainable Development Goals, at least there's some reference to Indigenous peoples in the area of Sustainable Development Goals. And I recall the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's last words to me when he was retiring. He said to me, "Don't let them leave you Indigenous peoples behind. Remember, the theme is no one left behind, but many are finding themselves being pushed behind." And I was at the UN when Canada was there for its first assessment on how it's doing with the SDGs. And the conclusion was that Canada was very, very far behind in terms of the SDGs. But if I may, I'd like to call us to action, to put more focus at home.
Okay, the focus at home, I think this is Dr. Littlechild, you make a very crucial point here, because the facade that Western countries like Canada give to the global South is everything is cushy here, everything is fine. We are the ones who are coming to save you. We don't have this perspective of the fact that a good chunk of development work is not being done here. And I don't know if it's saving face or whatever, but the point is, development work is not only abroad. I will open the floor for you to speak. We have another 2 minutes. You can just share your views so that we have a few minutes for chat. Dr. Andrews, you can go ahead.
Okay, so I will just make a couple of quick comments. So I think relocating the centers of authority when it comes to international development is very crucial. And when I talk about relocation of centers of authority, for instance, I think Oxfam International in 2017 decided to relocate its headquarters to Nairobi, Kenya, which is significant, although it doesn't solve all the problems that we're discussing today about power and privilege. In a way, it shows that there's a potential shift. So this sort of bottom-up approach that NGOs and international development organizations talk about a lot, it doesn't mean anything if you're still out here really speaking to the people down there, flying in and out and dealing with them as though you know the context, right? So I think those kinds of relocations will be useful in the future of international development, to showcase that we are actually trying to come in to understand, and not to sort of come in and bring our people to work in Nairobi, for instance, but actually to employ locals, because we believe that locals have equal knowledge and they actually know the context better than we do as the development experts coming in. So this is one quick example.
Thank you very much. And we go ahead, we go to Mai.
Just very quickly, I would say definitely examining structures and how the structures of an organization plays out the power dynamics. Offering training that goes beyond skills training. Larissa offered, critical analysis. So looking at soft skills as something that's really just equally as important as hard skills from an anti-colonial lens, and then really kind of integrating a lot more participatory approaches, working with the host countries.
Thank you very much. I think we've been doing the top-down thing for quite a while. And I'll go to Imam now.
Yeah, I think honestly everything good has already been said, but really just working with that community, I would say, is the biggest. I can't tell you how many times, I'm personally from the Pakistani community, how many times I've been approached by white women who've been like, hey, I want to do awesome work in Pakistan. I've made all these things. Come check it out. I want your community to support us. Asking our ethnic community to give us funds so they can go to my birth country to help them. And I've been like, okay, I want to know about your programs. We've had these discussions, and it's literally, I'm sorry, but you're basically just having a vacation. You want to have the food, you want to check out the culture, you want to have a good time. You feel bad for these poor people that need education. And half the times the words that they've used are things like savages. There's a lot of Islamophobia. I could go on for a million years. I think everybody already gave a grave, like honestly, excellent examples of what we need to be doing. But the reality comes, white saviorism is so very real. Colorism is everywhere, and white supremacy is something that's worldwide. It's not just in the West, it's worldwide. Yes, it presents itself in different forms. So the idea is that if you want to help people, you need to look beyond yourself. How is this going to go beyond me? If I want to help someone, I want the best for them. I don't want to be like, hey, this is going to go on my resume. This is going to be an awesome thing that's going to be good for me too. You don't think about yourself when you want to help people. And there's various different ways to help people. Number one thing, talk to them and involve them. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just says it all. And I'll now go to Larissa. Last words.
I'll keep it really short because I spoke quite a bit in my response. Just remember that any work that you're doing here is on Indigenous land, and that likely any work that you're doing abroad is on Indigenous land. Recognizing, especially here, there are many intersections between the SDGs and the TRC calls to action. And so just recognizing that and being aware of who you're involving in this work. And just making sure that you're involving appropriately the Indigenous voices on the lands on which you're working on.
Thank you so much, Larissa. So, it's just so well said. I think when people hear about development work, they actually think of this, volunteers who are ready to do whatever it takes. They don't realize there's a lot of paternalization that come with it. We call it infantilization, treating people as infants. People don't realize that to many people it's not development, it's a job. For some people it's simply a career. And whatever it is they are doing, they're just going to do it in order to just keep earning their salary. I don't know where the care comes. And it's very sad. And people will say, does it really matter? Yes, it matters a lot because we're dealing with people's lives. And people will say, are we going to outlast this? Well, I guess this conversation we're having is one of the ways of turning over and trying to reflect. Hopefully people will think. And I just want to say thank you so much for what you have given us today. I think it will make people think, and I just hope you also hang around for a few minutes so that you can hear and respond to some of the questions. At this point, again, I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to play the role of chair in this for this panel. I will hand over now to Lasha to handle the Q&A. Over to you, Lasha.
Hi, thank you. I'll go really quickly. We have some questions in the chat and the Q&A. One question is from Melissa. She says, the current conversation about development workers being white, global north, donor country, as distinct from other, global south, diverse, introduces a binary. For us as international development workers from Canada and from immigrant or Indigenous backgrounds, how does race, racism, and privilege operate for us grappling with the North and South? So anyone who wants to jump in, feel free.
I can just quickly answer if that's okay. I did answer Melissa and Shine in the chat, and I just shared that, you know, as individuals, there's obviously a lot of experiences that we have that are very real around power and race when we go overseas. Someone who's a white volunteer will be very different than someone who's a Black volunteer, you know, hyphen Canadian, and what they experience. However, just from my observations and working in a large institution like Global Affairs, for example, you still inherit that organizational structure. And so we still have to deconstruct and really challenge and analyze how those structures are playing out, because as individuals, we have a certain power, but we're also governed by the structures that we represent and that we work for.
Can I just add a little bit to that? So just, this isn't to say that if you're white, don't go overseas and do stuff. That's not what it is. I think it's the fact that before you go anywhere, please take a significant amount of time to actually study and research. And by that, I don't just mean going on Google and searching up how to be an awesome overseas volunteer or something like that. It means involving into yourself in books, into essays, into knowledge, into talking to people. And what I really want to press is that whether you're doing work here or overseas or anywhere really, first, do your research. Is somebody already doing that work? Can you aid that person? Are they from that community? Because there are people who are trying to help their community, whether it's in Canada or outside of Canada or wherever. So you can be an ally in many different ways. And maybe you really do want to travel and give yourself, you know, that experience. And again, that's totally fine. I think you really have to do that knowledge base. So if you go somewhere in Africa, you're not going with dreads at the end of the day. Or if you go to India and you want to learn all about yoga and namaste, you don't have dreads. Not to say that, you know, like that's not the only thing that I'm really talking about, but it's just, you don't go as a stereotype. You don't just take what you've learned from a Western perspective and you're like, oh, I'm a yogi now. This, like, you know, I know all about this and I'm everything. When it's like, you haven't really dwelled into the culture and the spirituality before just going there. Like, you need to do your research, and it involves way more than just a few days, a few months, or even a year.
All right, thank you. I think we'll do one last very quick question and then we'll wrap it up. We have a question, and I think this will be mainly for Larissa and Dr. Littlechild. This is the question. We have to problematize colonial education, which from the start was designed to thwart our trajectories of development and growth. Our systems of production, governance, and education were destroyed. Our stories and knowledge keepers, as many Indigenous populations, were oral societies. This was a decisive attempt to steal from Indigenous peoples, and I'm wondering what the panelists think of this. The Western education we inherit continues to perpetuate racism.
I can jump on in that, Dr. Littlechild, just because I have to go really quickly, and I'll keep mine short. Definitely 100%. I come from 7 generations of teachers. I've been very involved with the education system and recognizing how intentionally it's been weaponized to erase history's realities. And I think this is a global issue with regards to Indigenous nations and histories. So I guess one quick point would just be, I also want to recognize the resurgence of Indigenous education opportunities right now, in decolonial ways, in fellowship opportunities, in whole institutions, and then recognizing that, yes, this has happened, but there's so much resilience right now. I think it's a problem that we have to be so resilient. But I want to really acknowledge the ecosystem of Indigenous-led education programs in what is currently Canada right now, and that there are opportunities to know better. And it's on us to seek that out. And us as in being everyone. It's on us to really understand and seek those out. So that was my last point.
I don't know if I can jump in quickly. I wanted to also mention that I think we need to question how, and as an academic, we need to question how we are training the next generation of international development actors, those who are going to be working in these organizations that we're referring to, I mean, whom are part of this conference. How are we educating them to really understand development from a different perspective? Or even, I mean, again, post-colonial and post-development scholars will say development should be done away with entirely. But I mean, development, as you said, is actually a career for someone. So if it is really a career and that person is still going to hold on to it, or some students are interested in learning more about it and potentially using it for doing some good, how are we training them? How are we teaching them about different theories, alternative ways of understanding the world, alternative ways of knowing other people, or really reasoning to sort of understanding them? That would benefit the work that they hope to do in the future. I think that's very important to note. And in my development class, for instance, I came up with this idea of development in your backyard, where I was asking the students here at UMBC, Prince George, you think that, oh, in Canada, everyone is doing so well, we don't need development. But I was trying to teach the students to understand that, look, development is really around you, even if you don't see it. And you think of development as the poor child who is shown on TV, who cannot wipe the flies off their face and stuff, right? So those kind of notions of development. So I was trying to sort of flip it around and showcase to them that, look, homelessness, people not having access to food, all of that, those are developmental issues that are present everywhere. So I don't see development as being a north-south divide, but it's actually everywhere, right? So those are some of the things that we can teach the next generation to understand that even if I'm going abroad, it's not because I'm so well off and I have everything intact, but I'm actually going to be able to sort of learn with them, co-learn, unlearn, all the kinds of learnings that can happen to help different people advance the goals that they see themselves advancing.
And I think it goes back to that hiring practice thing. So who are the ones who are teaching, and what power do they have to actually change that course or that? Because I've taught at a college here before about racism, and I was discouraged to talk about white privilege. This was 4 years ago, but regardless, because the students were quite upset. I mean, all of them were white, so I guess they had that fragility piece there, and they were quite upset that I even brought up white privilege. This wasn't an international development course per se, but I didn't have the say to say that it's okay to talk about this and I should be allowed. And this is something that we've done numerous studies on, and it's not a new concept. So that's like a power that I personally didn't have in that position. So I think institutes also need to look at that organizational structure and be like, how can we improve this? Whose voice are we listening to, and whose voice do we have, are we not? And when I was in university, I took a lot of religious studies courses. Half the time it was taught by people who aren't even from that religion, who don't even identify with that culture even, the majority of people from that religion being from a certain culture. So who are the ones who are actually teaching us about all of this?
Thank you, Iman and Dr. Andrews. I'll just invite Dr. Littlechild if you'd like to answer that question or say some last thoughts, and then I'll wrap it up.
I was saying that I think post-COVID strategy is very important. Even a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan on not only what we think the world will look like, but what we want Alberta, Treaty 6, 7, and 8 to look like. Successful, healthy, prosperous, so that we can continue to work to help others globally. It'll take all of us working together to have a peaceful coexistence, to have a true reconciliation, also to restore respectful relationships, but most of all, to build on the strengths of each other and work very, very hard on unity. For me, that's how we will be able to deal with racism in all the forms of hatred that we have today. Hi, thank you very much. And lastly, welcome to all of you to Treaty 6 territory.
Thank you so much, Dr. Littlechild. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you especially to Dr. Okeke for moderating. I would like to say, if you're wondering, if you were an attendee and you're wondering what you can do next as an individual or an organization to work towards anti-racism, we have a great session tomorrow called What Can We Do About It? It's a coffee chat, and it's designed to be an open space to have conversations about the tools you're using, your experiences, shortcomings with anti-racism or gender equality. So that will be tomorrow at 1 p.m. We had some good comments today too about tools. What tools can we use towards anti-racism? And part of the conference is we've offered these anti-racism boxes from the Edmonton Shift Lab. We still have a few left, so if you didn't get one, it's a great way to work through terms like white fragility and what it means to truly be anti-racist. And this will be the end of our conference sessions for today. Please make sure to check out the documentary made available by Marda Loop Justice Film Festival, an ACGC member organization. The link to the documentary is in the chat box. And we hope to see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the impact of COVID pandemic and response on women and girls around the world, which will be another great panel. So thank you again to everybody for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.